All right, brace yourselves for this absolute beauty of a political disaster. Sir Keir Starmer, the man who promised stability, competence, and a return to serious government, is now watching helplessly as Nigel Farage Reform UK surges in the polls like a rocket fueled by pure public fury, and Labour have essentially admitted they got absolutely no strategy to stop him. None. Zero. Zilch. It's like watching a football team prepare for the biggest match of their lives by admitting they haven't bothered learning the opponent's tactics, don't know who's playing striker, and frankly aren't entirely sure which goal they're supposed to defend. Farage is out there declaring that the British public are sick to death of being lectured by out-of-touch elites, and rather than proving him wrong, Labour are inadvertently providing Exhibit A, B, and C for his entire argument. This is a story of how the supposedly unbeatable Labour majority might be facing an existential threat they never saw coming, and how Nigel Farage, the man who's been written off more times than a dodgy insurance claim, might be having the last laugh after all. Quick favour. If you're absolutely loving this political chaos and want British Mirror to keep bringing you the juiciest Westminster drama, hit that subscribe button and smash the bell icon. Over 94% of you watching haven't subscribed yet. It's completely free, takes literally 2 seconds, and helps us enormously. Cheers if you did. Right, back to Labour's Farage-shaped nightmare. Let's start with the elephant in the room, or should I say, the perpetually grinning provocateur in the political arena, Nigel Farage. This man has spent decades as a boogeyman of British politics, the figure that establishment parties love to dismiss, ridicule, and underestimate, right up until he delivers them a catastrophic electoral kicking they never recovered from. He did it with UKIP, forcing David Cameron into the Brexit referendum that ultimately destroyed his premiership. He did it again with the Brexit Party, absolutely demolishing Conservatives in the 2019 European Parliament elections. And now, with Reform UK, he's positioning himself to do it all over again, except this time Labour are in his crosshairs, and they appear to have brought a plastic spoon to a gunfight. Farage's message is devastatingly simple and brutally effective. The British public are sick to death of being lectured by these out-of-touch elites who have destroyed this country, and they are voting in their droves for reform to get Britain back on track. Now, you might think this is hyperbolic nonsense, the usual populist rabble-rousing that sensible voters would see through immediately. Except, and here's where it gets uncomfortable for Labour, the polling suggests he might actually be onto something. Reform UK has been climbing steadily in the polls, in some surveys now sitting in second place nationally, ahead of the Conservatives and snapping at Labour's heels. That's not fringe protest party territory anymore, that's serious electoral threat level. What makes Farage particularly dangerous right now is that it has identified the exact vulnerabilities in Labour's political position that Starmer seems oblivious to. Labour came to power promising change, but have delivered more of the same establishment thinking. They promise to listen to working-class concerns, but have spent months implementing policies that weren't in their manifesto and that directly harm ordinary people. They promise competence, but have U-turned on major policies within weeks of announcing them. Every single one of these failures becomes ammunition for Farage's narrative that the entire political establishment, Labour included, are fundamentally disconnected from the lives and concerns of normal British people. The phrase out-of-touch elites is doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting in Farage's rhetoric, and Labour are making his job ridiculously easy. When you've got a Prime Minister who struggles to give a straight answer about whether flying your country's flag is good, when you've got ministers more concerned about international law than stopping boats crossing the Channel, when you've got a government that seems more interested in lecturing the public about their attitudes than actually solving their problems, Farage doesn't need to make up attack lines. He just needs to point at what's happening and say, "See, I told you so." Now let's talk about what makes this situation absolutely terrifying for Starmer. Labour apparently have no plan whatsoever to counter the reform surge. None. They've been caught completely flat-footed by Farage's rise, seemingly assuming that their massive parliamentary majority would insulate them from electoral challenges for years. That's the kind of complacency that gets governments destroyed, and history is littered with examples of dominant parties that thought they were untouchable right up until they weren't. The Liberal Party dominated British politics for decades until they didn't. Labour had huge majorities in the early 2000s until they didn't. The Conservatives seemed unbeatable under Thatcher until they weren't. Political gravity always reasserts itself eventually, and Labour are currently speeding toward the ground with no parachute. What should genuinely worry Labour strategists, assuming any are paying attention, is that reform's appeal cuts directly into what should be Labour's core vote. Working-class communities in the North and Midlands, the red wall seats that Labour lost to the Conservatives in 2019 and partially won back in 2024, these are exactly constituencies where reform is making serious inroads. These voters don't want lecture tours about progressive values. They want their streets safe, their borders controlled, their communities invested in, and their concerns taken seriously. When they feel Labour isn't delivering on any of those things, Farage is standing there with open arms saying, "I hear you, I understand you, and I'll fight for you." Whether he means it or whether he can actually deliver is almost irrelevant if Labour keep giving voters reasons to want an alternative. The voting in their droves claim from Farage might sound like typical bombast, but the evidence increasingly backs it up. By-elections have shown reform taking substantial vote shares, often coming second and sometimes genuinely threatening to win. Local election results have seen reform councillors elected in areas that were previously solid Labour or Conservative territory. Membership numbers for reform have reportedly surged. Most tellingly, focus groups and polling consistently show significant numbers of voters, particularly older working-class men, saying they are seriously considering voting reform at the next general election. That's the exact same mistake the Conservatives made with UKIP for years, dismissing them as fruitcakes and loonies and closet racists, right up until UKIP forced them into positions they never wanted to take and ultimately dragged Britain out of the European Union. You cannot wish away a political movement that's tapping into genuine public sentiment, no matter how much you might want to. You have to actually engage with the concerns driving people toward that movement and offer compelling alternatives. Labour are doing neither. The Border Security Commander Martin Hewitt's comment that the number of arrivals is frustrating, but that stopping the smuggling route was always going to take time is exactly the kind of excuse-making that drives voters mad. How much time? How many more years? How many more tens of thousands of illegal arrivals before we see actual results? Labour has been in power for 18 months. They had time to implement policies, establish enforcement priorities, allocate resources, and the numbers are worse than ever. At what point does this takes time become an admission of failure rather than a request for patience? The Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Act that became law in December introduces new criminal offenses and counter-terror-style powers to crack down on smuggling gangs. That sounds impressive until you realize that we already had laws against people smuggling. We already had enforcement powers. The problem has never been lack of legal authority. The problem is lack of political will to use the authority we have, lack of resources devoted to enforcement, and most fundamentally, lack of an effective deterrent that makes crossing the channel in small boats an unattractive option for migrants. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood's November announcement of the most significant changes to our asylum system in modern times also deserves scrutiny. The reforms, inspired by Denmark's system, would make refugee status temporary with reviews every 30 months, and refugees would wait 20 years for permanent settlement instead of 5. That's genuinely tougher than current policy, and it sparked backlash from Labour MPs who called it shameful and accused the government of echoing Farage's rhetoric. But here's the thing, those reforms haven't been introduced in legislation yet. They are just announcements, promises of future action. And even if implemented, they don't address the fundamental problem of people arriving illegally in the first place. The criticism from Labour MPs that these reforms echo Reform UK is also revealing. It shows that Labour is internally divided on immigration, with the progressive wing viewing any enforcement or restriction as right-wing and shameful, whilst the government tries to appear tough to voters who elected them partially on promises to control immigration. That internal tension makes coherent policy impossible. You end up with rhetoric that sounds tough to reassure voters, combined with implementation that's weak because your own backbenchers rebel against anything genuinely restrictive. Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch's argument that these measures don't go far enough and that leaving the European Convention on Human Rights is necessary represents a tougher end of the political spectrum. Both Conservatives and Reform UK want to quit the ECHR, viewing it as a fundamental obstacle preventing effective immigration control. Labour insists they won't leave but will seek to adjust how immigration cases are interpreted in UK law, which sounds like having your cake and eating it too. You can't remain bound by a treaty whilst interpreting it so differently that you're effectively ignoring it. Either the ECHR constraints matter or they don't. Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy meeting ECHR member states to discuss reforming the treaty to address illegal migration is theatre. The ECHR is not going to fundamentally change its human rights protections because Britain is frustrated with immigration consequences. Other member states don't share Britain's small boat problem to the same degree and have no incentive to weaken human rights protections that they value. This diplomatic outreach will produce nothing of substance whilst allowing Labour to claim they're exploring all options short of actually leaving the treaty. Now let's talk about the one-in, one-out returns deal with France that Farage calls a farce. Under this pilot scheme, people arriving in the UK by small boat can be detained and returned to France in exchange for an equivalent number coming through safe and legal routes. As of mid-December, 193 migrants had been sent back to France and 195 had arrived under the deal. So it's basically a one-to-one exchange with no net reduction in numbers. Worse, there have been cases of migrants being returned to France under the deal, then crossing again and being caught, requiring a second deportation. How exactly is that a deterrent? The scheme's fundamental flaw is obvious. If you get caught crossing illegally, the worst that happens is you're sent back to France, from where you can simply try again. And in exchange for accepting returns, France gets to send equivalent numbers to the UK through official channels. So Britain isn't reducing overall immigration. It's just shuffling people between categories whilst creating the appearance of enforcement. This is what Farage means by calling it a farce. Its immigration policy is theatre rather than substance. The human cost of this policy failure is also worth noting. At least 17 people died attempting the journey last year, according to French and UK authorities, though there's no official record of channel fatalities. The International Organization for Migration reports possibly 36 deaths linked to attempts to reach the UK from mainland Europe. These deaths are tragic and preventable.